I'm Lisa Fine, and I'm one of the co-hosts of the Great Women in Compliance podcast. You are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report. Check out Great Women in Compliance on the Compliance Podcast Network, and it posts every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. You can also join in the conversation at the GWIC community on LinkedIn as well.
In this episode, I have back fan favorite Mike DeBernardis. Mike is a partner at Hughes Hubbard. We take a look at key enforcement actions and issues from Q2 of 2021. I know you will enjoy it. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis, for now partner at Hughes Hubbard. Proud to be able to say that. But we're back for our sort of quarterly review and wrap up. So, Mike, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Excited to be back. Always enjoy coming on and talking about recent developments.
So let's start with FCPA, and particularly the really lack of FCPA enforcements. I think we both agree that's meaningless, but perhaps we could explore that a little bit. But I guess we did have one FCPA case, which I thought was interesting, but perhaps more interesting, we had several individual prosecutions. And I guess I just wanted to start with, we had the Yates memo back in 2015, and I know that was a big discussion internally at Hughes Hubbard. I think you and I visited about it. I've certainly thought about it and written about it, what it might mean down the road. Is what we're seeing here in the first half of 2021 really something that's either fallout or the continuation of the Yates memo, or is it just business as usual at the Department of Justice fraud section?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't think I'm spilling state secrets here, but Tom, when we do these talks, you often send me some topics in advance, give me a chance to look smart and study up before we discuss. And when I saw this one, I hadn't thought about the Yates memo in quite some time. At least thought about it critically in terms of how it's affecting current prosecutions. And so I went back and did some number crunching just to kind of get a sense, at least from the FCPA perspective, right? We now have a lot of data. It's been 5 years plus since the Yates memo. I think it was September 2015. And so I don't want to bore you with numbers, but if that was September 2015 when the Yates memo came out, the 2 years before that, I think in 2013, there was 14 individual prosecutions, FCPA-related prosecutions filed. In 2014, it was 11. 2015, there was 18. These aren't perfect numbers, but this was sort of my quick calculations. And then the following year, it sort of stayed the same. It was 19. And then we saw this big jump. So 2017, 2018, and 2019, we had over 30 each year. So I really think if we had seen a sort of cause and effect, it was in that time frame when it would have happened. Ironically enough, sort of after Sally Yates left the DOJ there. But then in 2020 we saw 16, and this year it feels like this year we're seeing a ton of individual prosecutions. I think part of that is that there's been this absence of corporate prosecutions. But I think there's only been 4 that have been filed this year. A couple filed at the end of last year that were announced this year. So I really think even before I crunch the numbers, just sort of thinking about it, I think at this point, this is just business as usual. Individual prosecutions are a big part of what the fraud section is doing in terms of FCPA enforcement. It could have been a practice and a focus that started after the Yates memo in September 2015 that carried over and really took effect in 2017, 2018, 2019. But at this point, this is sort of just where we are. I don't know how much you can put this current year into that neat box of, hey, this is a direct byproduct of the Yates memo.
We did have one FCPA corporate enforcement action involving a deferred prosecution agreement, and we've talked about, I guess, in a kind of our Q1 wrap up, we talked about I think we agreed the meaninglessness of no corporate prosecutions as of that point. I'm of the inclination that one is equally meaningless. Just today, we had the Department of Justice head of the criminal section approved by the Senate. So we're still getting the political appointee level. And I guess my message would be nothing's changed. this administration has said they'll be aggressive in enforcement in a variety of areas. I wouldn't expect it to be any different. But do you see things differently from, where you guys are sitting these days?
No, I don't. I have some numbers on this too that I'll get to, but I'm curious. I mean, you talk to a lot of people, Tom. Have you talked to anybody in this space that does place a lot of meaning on this sort of lack of enforcement over the first, 7 months of the year?
No, because historically, we've had years where there were less than 10 cases, sometimes less than 5 in a 6-month period. And, we had one year where there was 28 in 1 month. It's just the nature of the beast. They're lengthy investigations and settlement negotiations. And then when they're ready for settlement, there's no calendar, really timetable going forward. They're resolved. So I guess that's taught me over the last 10 years plus, there's no rhyme or reason for few cases, no cases, or a ton of cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I went back and was looking at sort of the data again. And in 2017, which was the last, change of administration, right? We had a similar situation actually. And I think it's thrown off a little bit because we had these 4 corporate prosecutions in January, actually before the inauguration in January, but then not another one until September of 2017. So we had a big gap there. I think people didn't pay as much attention because we had these 4 at the beginning of the year. There is no sort of rhyme or reason for it necessarily. I'm sure there's a number of factors that go into it, including the fact that we've got a lot of turnover right now. There are certainly a lot of open investigations. If you look at the number of public companies that have disclosed FCPA violations, I think it's up over 100. So there's certainly a number of investigations, and I think it's a matter of timing, like you said. There's no formula that says there's got to be 3 cases a quarter, unfortunately. So I really read pretty much nothing into it. It's interesting from a sort of historical data perspective, but I really read nothing into it. And I think what we've seen in the past is when you have one of these gaps, you often have a sort of corresponding deluge of settlement that come afterwards. So there's a little course correction.
One of the things we did have was the Biden administration released a statement on corruption as a national security issue. And certainly that may fall closer into tone at the top than actual implementation. But when you have that tone at the top, what I wrote about and what I tried to convey was that message would then move down throughout the department, and not simply the Department of Justice, but multiple other agencies in the U.S. government, from the FTC, as obviously the SEC, but also the OCC, and perhaps other agencies. Did you see it in that manner, or were you able to really not simply talk about it internally and what it might mean, but really have conversations with clients? And if so, how did those conversations go?
Yeah, I'll be honest. When the memo first came out, my initial thought was, this is going to be something that's fun for the practitioners to talk and prognosticate about, but it's really going to be kind of meaningless. That was my initial thought. And then we started getting questions from clients that were a little more sector specific. How's this going to affect me? How's this going to potentially affect me? How's this going to affect our competitors, et cetera? And so that's when, I started giving it a little bit more critical thought. There's a lot of different ways this could go. And I think a lot of it, honestly, will depend on the interagency review that I believe is currently ongoing. Currently ongoing. You can certainly see, as you mentioned, there's that tone at the top, and we've already had this trend over the last several years of sort of other agencies that you might not expect jumping in to in the anti-corruption sphere. CFTC last year and the year before kind of had some resolutions that had corruption focus. So you could see that sort of playing out. I could also see, I was talking to one defense client who was asking about it, and the Department of Defense, of course, is part of the interagency review. I could certainly see some additional hurdles and regulations that the DoD puts in place for U.S. government defense contractors contracting with foreign governments in terms of maybe requiring some additional diligence steps, some more transparency, it's stuff like that to really. I think these agencies are going to focus a lot on their area and try to see where corruption comes into play. And there's a potential that they come up with ideas that have a sort of waterfall effect on companies in terms of, hey, here's some things we're going to put in place to try to attack corruption in our specific space.
So simply because there was a dearth of FCPA cases did not mean the Department of Justice was not out there investigating and prosecuting. I've really thought a lot about False Claims Act, fraud, particularly around PPP and PPE. Is that something you guys are seeing inquiries from clients about? Or are you actually actively counseling clients on other fraud actions brought by the department?
Yeah, I wrote an article about this towards the beginning of the year. Historically, when you have a big government spending in whether it's emergency spending after Katrina or TARP back in after the 2008 financial crisis, the FCA actions, the False Claims Act actions, they follow on. It's like clockwork, because whenever you have big spending, you're going to have the fraudulent. You're going to have the overtly fraudulent actions involved with that. And then you're also going to have just the missteps that otherwise honest but perhaps negligent or careless companies are going to make. And so I absolutely expect this to be a focus. I mean, the Department of Justice has said they're going to sort of actively go after fraud, but I think that the False Claims Act piece is sort of what's next to come. Whether that's companies that accepted, participated in the PPP, I think, as part of the sort of the secondary stimulus package, there was a lot of money earmarked for various sectors. There was infrastructure, whatever it was, $30 billion for infrastructure. We throw these numbers around like they're meaningless, but $30 billion is a lot of money. And so you're gonna have companies who are ultimately participating in those projects, maybe companies that really haven't been a government contractor in the past, and so the False Claims Act and all the sort of compliance issues that come along with it, they might not be as familiar with. So I think the level of spending we just saw is absolutely unprecedented. I would be very surprised if there's not a corresponding level of unprecedented FCA action in response. That's absolutely our expectation. That's what we've been telling clients. I don't have any active matters with it right now, but I expect we will, here in the near future.
We'll be right back with Mike DeBernardis after this message. Mike, one of the agencies that has been active, particularly around communicating its expectations, now been the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have had, I think, a fairly dramatic change in philosophy, both enforcement of philosophy and investigation philosophy. We've had a couple of actions around SPACs, and we've had lots of discussions around corporate disclosures on climate change, ESG, and other areas not emphasized by the prior administration. Where are you guys on that? Are you actively counseling? Are clients coming to you asking for help around what do we have to disclose in our Ks and Qs? Where are you guys on the SEC right now?
I'd say we're getting far more questions, seeing far more issues with respect to the SEC than the DOJ right now. And part of that, the enforcement focus for the SEC tends to vary more wildly depending on the administration and the leadership than the DOJ does. The DOJ's, they're out there to prosecute crimes, and they're going to continue to do that. The SEC, I think Republican leadership often takes a different approach to enforcement than Democratic leadership. And so we do see sort of these, changes in resourcing and focus on enforcement more. It's felt more acutely, I think, with respect to the SEC. And certainly, the leadership that's been put in place at the SEC, both SEC proper and the enforcement division, I think signals that a change there. So we have been seeing getting a lot of questions, dealing with a lot of issues in that area. You hit on some of the big ones. SPACs obviously are stealing headlines right now, and I think there's going to be a focus on that. Anytime a new sort of vehicle or financial mechanism is used and is in the Wall Street Journal a lot, the SEC is going to take a close look at it. I think we're going to see, and we've been getting questions on this too, whether it's accounting fraud or, disclosure issues around the pandemic, disclosures that companies made about their financial position during the pandemic and seeing how that plays out. There was a lot of pressure on companies not to, not to raise too much of an alarm during the pandemic. And so I think we'll see some focus on that. And then two other areas where sort of moving forward, I think we're gonna see a lot of attention, and it's just certainly in areas where our clients have been coming to us asking about, hey, what's this going to look like? One is in sort of the cybersecurity area. It's in the news every day about the various hacks, whether it's ransomware or hacks just to steal data. So that's one area where the SEC's certainly has in the past taken a look, and I think a closer look, and we'll see enforcement there. And the other one you touched on, which is around climate and ESG. We've got this climate and ESG task force now, and I think that will be perhaps we'll see the most stark difference there, obviously, because that's something brand new where I think it'll take some time, but by the end of this 4-year run for President Biden, until leading into the 2024 election, we'll really start to see some action and movement there. And we are getting more than ever questions from clients about ESG and what they can do in terms of ESG and compliance, and what they can say for our publicly traded companies, what they can say, and being careful about that.
One of the areas that I've seen a lot of commentary in, I'm kind of the opinion it's a problem in search of a solution in search of a problem, is the question of CCO individual liability. It typically comes up in regulated industries, but it sometimes bleeds over into U.S. public companies. The New York City Bar Association published some proposed standards that they would suggest the SEC used. The current standards are basically, if you're involved in the fraud, you're subject to SEC sanction, whether it be civil or criminal prosecution, although it's typically civil. Also, if you are completely incompetent, you don't know what you're doing, or you basically buried your head in the sand through conscious indifference. Someone who's been in those positions, I'm comfortable with that standard, and I think it's an appropriate standard. But I really wanted to ask your opinion on this. Is that something that you guys are getting questions about, or are CCOs really worrying about individual liability, or is this something different?
Historically, Tom, I would say the compliance officers more generally, not just the chief compliance officers, but compliance officers at our clients, their level of concern with respect to sort of their own individual liability depends a lot on the personality. You have some that are just absolute worrywart and that are going to sort of be incredibly nervous, and perhaps they're less confident in their own jobs, or feel like they're being sort of pushed in one direction or another. But for the most part, I think they certainly notice when a compliance officer is penalized, and as you mentioned, it's almost always civil penalty. And there will be a buzz of activity and questions that might come that follows on to that, almost always in a regulated industry, right? Financial services and that sort of thing. But overall, I think this is something I've talked about in the past, something that I've gotten questions on in the past, something that I've been asked to write on in the past. I think this is another area where we, sitting in our chairs comfortably here, like to talk about, but doesn't it doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, the standard you just articulated really is to me entirely appropriate. If you're actively involved in the offense, it doesn't matter what your position is, you can be held liable. If you are sort of consciously, putting your head in the sand and ignoring it, especially as a compliance officer, you're going to be held liable. And I'm fortunate enough not to have met any compliance officers, certainly chief compliance officers, who take that approach. And then if you are grossly negligent, to me, those are similar scenarios, right? Gross negligence almost to me means that you're sort of ignoring a problem, just putting your head in the sand. I think it doesn't matter what your position is. If you're that, if you were that sort of intentionally bad at your job, there could be some fallout to that. Honestly, I think compliance officers are comfortable with that. Where it's going to get trickier, and where it does get trickier, is if you sort of start taking if regulators sort of start taking the backward-looking approach of, okay, we had an issue, you really should have known about that, compliance officer, and now we're going to hold you responsible. That's where I think compliance officers would get some heartburn, and understandably so, because it's a hard job. It doesn't matter what the industry is. Being a compliance officer is a hard job, and I know you and I have talked about it in the past. Just because there's misconduct or an issue doesn't mean that the compliance program failed or that the compliance officer failed. There's no sort of perfect compliance system to prevent misconduct. So I think that's where certainly if I was in-house anywhere, I would be nervous, but I haven't quite seen that standard being talked about.
So one of the reasons I enjoy visiting with you is we get to really geek out sometimes. So for those listeners who out there who like that, we're about to geek out. When I started practicing law in Texas, there was a huge change in the definition of gross negligence. So I only learned the new definition, and that definition was the entire want of care, just some care, the entire want. So I learned that, and that's been my kind of definition for gross negligence growing up professionally. And I find that to be an appropriate way to define what you described. And so I'm extremely comfortable with that as a test and even as a standard from the SEC. And when I'm asked that question at a conference, I say, now listen to me very carefully. There have been zero enforcement actions, civil or criminal, where a chief compliance officer was charged with negligence. It's always that higher standard. And so I'm really comfortable with that because, once again, it's the entire want of care, not just, you screwed up or you messed up or you had some care but not enough care. It's the entire want of care. And so I really find that to be an appropriate standard. And to your point, we should be judged by that. If we are grossly negligent, we shouldn't be in that position. We're either not competent or we let somebody else influence us. So is that kind of consistent with your thought approach in that?
Absolutely. And look, the reality is too, even the cases where you've seen the standard being used as gross negligence, the reality is I think there's often the suspicion that the compliance officer was actually directly involved. And maybe there wasn't quite enough to actually show actual involvement. And so you fall back on this gross negligence standard. We have not today seen sort of many of the regulators, whether FinCEN, SEC, an appetite to even go after compliance officers who are just bad at their jobs, right? There's always something else there. And I think your description of that standard is exactly right. And that's sort of the comfort that you can give the clients too, is, if you're not directly involved in this and you're at least trying to do your job, you're going to be safe. This is not, we have not reached a point where compliance officers are being prosecuted civilly or certainly criminally for just not being great at their job.
One of the areas that I think might be ripe for change in enforcement is in the area of environmental crimes. And I don't mean SEC disclosures around climate change. I mean environmental crimes. I think that was one area that was not a focus of the prior administration. Is that something you guys are either fielding questions from clients on or talking about internally? And how should companies really think about a change in that enforcement arena?
At the beginning of the year, I had a number of clients who asked, us to either draft something or do a brief presentation on where do we think the Biden administration is going to focus enforcement, or where's that's not even what they really wanted. What they really wanted was what are be the biggest changes in enforcement from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And I always included environmental crime on this list. I think this is certainly not my area of expertise. Others at the firm have more experience in this than I do. But I know enough to know that this was not a focus of the Trump administration. You could even go further and say sort of it was a point to not focus on it. And whether it is through a new task force, because there's a lot of talk right now. I think it was in January, Biden issued an executive order on this to really make this more of a focus, and environmental justice being a big focus. And I think we will see some changes within the Department of Justice in terms of how they attack these things. But even just Environmental Protection Agency enforcement actions, I expect it to be a big turnaround. It's something I'm watching closely in terms of where does this go, particularly with the environmental justice piece that they're pushing at the Department of Justice. Where does this land? Because we have clients that this is a bigger issue for than others. But I think even for our clients where you wouldn't necessarily think of environmental issues as being one of their high risk factors, depending on the approach the Department of Justice takes with the environmental justice initiative, it could become one. And so it's something that we're keeping a close eye on, certainly. When we bring that up in these papers and discussions with clients, it's one the clients are always sort of interested in, but also I think not surprised by, because it was sort of very publicly was not a focus of the Trump administration.
Mike, one of the reasons I enjoy working with you and your colleagues at Hughes Hubbard is you're great at putting out sort of retrospective pieces, obviously your annual FCPA review and other client alerts, but you also are prospective and you think about things that may be coming down the pike or clients need to think about or just, thought leadership in different areas of the law. So I wanted to maybe conclude with asking, is there anything that you guys are talking about internally that we need to start thinking about from other areas, or are there concerns? I mean, we've had a lot of information from the new administration already about the directions they may be going. So are you seeing some tea leaves out there that we need to at least watch?
Yeah, I think we touched on a couple of them already, Tom, a little bit, which is certainly False Claims Act stuff, both for our government contracting clients and for our non-government contracting clients who, were involved in the stimulus in one way or another, is an area. I have not gotten so many questions about ESG in the last 2 months, more in the last 2 months than I had in the last 10 years of my career. It's just, everybody's talking about it. If you go on LinkedIn, everybody's posting about it. I mean, it's a huge area of focus and interest. So that's certainly there. And then, one thing that we didn't talk about, certainly not my area of focus, although the firm is quite good at it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that my wife is also quite good at it, is in the area of antitrust enforcement. I think it was earlier, it was either earlier this month or last month, that Biden, issued an order on that saying this is going to be an area of focus. I don't think anybody doubts that. I think we're going to see over the next few years really an unprecedented amount of antitrust enforcement, both criminally and civilly, in areas we haven't even thought about in the past. And I know my colleagues at Hughes Hubbard are certainly gearing up for that.
Certainly in the FTC with their new chairman Khan and the head of the antitrust division, I think pretend a more aggressive approach. But maybe, and then of course on both sides of the aisle, amazingly enough, there is pushback against big tech, and they Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook are all in the regulators' headlights. But what about maybe smaller companies, smaller cartels? We've had a lot of cartel work in the chicken space, interestingly enough, and I'm sure there are others. Do you think that these big cases are going to suck the air out of the antitrust division so that they really only focus on these massive kind of generational cases, or do you really see a more aggressive approach up and down the line in antitrust?
I see this as being increased enforcement across the board. I think there's two issues I think that are bipartisan at this point. We're down to two. One of them is big tech. Everybody wants to get on big tech in one way or another, and so I think we will, of course, see a lot of antitrust action in big tech. The other is China, and everybody is coming up with ways to be anti-China. But in terms of antitrust enforcement, I think big tech's obviously going to be a focus. But if you read that order carefully, I mean, we're talking sort of the directions from the very top are take a look at everything. Take a look at no poach agreements. Take a look at price fixing. Take a look at old school cartel type behavior across the board. And so that's what I would expect to see. I think any smaller company hoping that the attention moves away from their industry to focus on big tech is probably not approaching it safely, because I really don't think that's going to be. Those are obviously going to be big headline stealing cases, but I wouldn't say anyone's safe from that watchful eye.
Well, Mike, as always, it's been a ton of fun. We're going to link to your profile on the Hughes Hubbard site. But if anyone wanted to contact you and really follow up on any of the topics we've touched on today, how could they do so?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to call, email. The email is michael.debernardis@Hughes Hubbard. I'm always happy to talk about these things, and please feel free to connect on LinkedIn too. You'd be surprised at how often, whether it's through this or another type of speaking engagement, I get follow-up questions on LinkedIn, and it's always really fun to engage with people on these topics. I enjoy just talking about this stuff, whether it's with clients or folks like yourself.
Well, Mike, I look forward to our next conversation. Perhaps in Q3, we'll have a different set of issues to visit about.
Yeah, maybe we'll see some actual enforcement and be able to dive into some cases a little bit, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you're interested in history, specifically the Greek and Roman period, I hope you will check out the special podcast series Richard Lummis and I are running on 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. We're taking a look at Plutarch's lives and bringing it forward for leadership lessons for the 21st century. A fascinating series on one of the seminal biography and textbooks of history. If you're interested in history, biography, Greeks or Romans, I know you will enjoy it. Please check it out. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.